Some people believe it's cheating the system to put your money offshore, but others insist it's just good financial planning if you do it right and legally. Today we're going to shed light on what seems to many like a very grey area. We'd love to hear your views and indeed your experiences of going offshore too. The number to call now is 03 700 100 444. And you can also email us. The address is moneybox@bbc.co.uk, or you can tweet us using the hashtag BBC Moneybox. I'm joined by John Cullinane from the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Paula Tallon, a tax partner at Gabel, Frank Cochrane from Wealth Managers FSC Investment Services in Wolverhampton, he's in our Birmingham studio, and Alex Cobham from the Tax Justice Network is down the line in Oxford. Alex Cobham, I just want to start talking about really the scale of offshore. The UK government estimates the tax gap in the UK is about £34 billion a year. So that means that more than 6% of the tax that they think they should be collecting is staying in the pockets of companies and individuals. And some of this is presumably offshore. How big do people estimate offshore is?
Well, in terms of multinationals, the best estimates are that, particularly for American multinationals, about 25% of their profits globally are not declared in the jurisdictions where the economic activity took place, and that makes the HMRC estimate look rather conservative. In terms of individuals' assets offshore, the low-end estimate is by a leading economist called Gabriel Zucman, who works with Thomas Piketty, and his estimate is about $8 trillion. Now, that's specifically of money that is not declared to the Home Tax Authority, so that would be tax-evading assets. An estimate done for us at the Tax Justice Network for a broader range of financial assets puts that much higher at $21 to $32 trillion globally. So we're talking something like 10% or more of the total global private household wealth.
Which is a huge amount if it's true. Of course, it's hard to know because it's very hard to know exactly what's going on in some of these places, how much money is there and whose money it is. I mean, you mentioned we have multinational companies that arrange their structures so that some of their operations are offshore. Then sort of at a more extreme end, you have people who are using offshore to do money laundering. John Cullinane, what does tax evasion look like when someone's trying to do something like that, or money laundering, something extreme and definitely illegal offshore?
Well, at the basic level, tax evasion could look very simple. So years ago, no doubt people set up bank accounts in Jersey or wherever, and simply didn't tell anybody here about it. And, that would be the end of it. I mean, as obviously governments have coordinated more, including many of those jurisdictions, to exchange information, people might then set up companies and trusts so that the account's not in their name, and it gets more complicated. But the basic idea is simply not reporting it to the authorities. So that's the issue. I mean, I should say there are perfectly legitimate reasons why people might set up companies and trusts and use offshore accounts, but the possibility of using it legally is very, very simple to describe.
And yet, Alex Cobham, these people who, it might be proceeds from a robbery or something like that ends up in one of these faraway places without the names of the people who really have that money now on the fund. How complicated do these structures get?
Well, it can be very complicated, but equally, as John says, it can be very simple. A set of structures that we've seen revealed lately involve having bank accounts, perhaps in Switzerland, held by companies operating out of Panama, which are in turn owned by trusts or foundations operating from perhaps from the Channel Islands. With those layers of secrecy, it becomes much harder to penetrate. Even if you find the information about ownership in one of those jurisdictions, say you're a law enforcement agency from the UK trying to penetrate this, you're then on to the next one. And during all that process, there's a possibility of the people involved simply shutting it down or moving elsewhere. So you're racing against the clock to unpick the secrecy before the underlying ownership changes. We'll
talk more later about what the authorities around the world are trying to do to to stop this kind of activity or slow it down, and how difficult that might be, as you say. But as we've said, there are legal ways to have your money offshore. Lots of people do it. Frank Cochrane, as a wealth manager, you advise your clients to put their money offshore. What sort of clients do you have who want to do this, and why?
We've got a broad spectrum of clients. I mean, for the last 20 years, as a nation, we've been encouraged to celebrate working and living in a global economy. And then as soon as we do it, everybody starts jumping on the bandwagon of saying, oh, well, this is illegal because somebody's doing better than others. As an FCA regulated advisor, we have to work with fully compliant approved investments. But that allows us to invest in places like Dublin, Guernsey, Jersey, places like that. And the main benefit to our clients is that they get completely tax-free growth. But you have to remember, when the clients then repatriate the money into the UK, there may be a liability to income tax. Now, that means that we can use these investments for clients who are just your normal Mr. and Mrs. Joe Bloggs on the street, right up to multinationals. But the problem that we've seen with this whole problem of these shell companies, I think, comes down to the financial secrecy. And when people aren't willing to put their name to a piece of paper, it's bound to bring up the question of what is it they've done that's illegal? Why are they scared to put their name to it? And it's created this whole, if you like, washing machine of people now starting to jump on the bandwagon and say, well, everybody needs to tell everything now. And I don't think necessarily that that's true. I think we've gone way too overboard on this now.
But are your clients not benefiting from a certain amount of secrecy, a certain cloak of secrecy that can go across their investments when they're offshore?
None whatsoever. Because we're regulated, the first thing that we have to do is to money launder the clients, which means that when the client comes to us, we demand to see their passport, driving licence and 2 forms of identity, which has been valid for the last 3 months. The idea behind that is we're not going to be taking money off terrorists. We're not going to be taking money off people who have brought it in via a crime or any other drug deals or anything like that. I won't deal with people unless they can prove to me that that money's been given to them, or they've inherited it, or they've worked for it in a legitimate way. Now, when I'm talking to a company, we do the same level of due diligence. We look at the company's accounts. We look to see whether money's been generated, if it's come from profits. I've got no problem in helping that company to put that money into the most tax-efficient investment that we can, because at the end of the day, like everybody else, they want to make money.
OK, Frank,
thank
you.
In the right way.
I'll just stop you there, because we've got Alex on the line from Somerset who I want to bring in. Alex, what's your point?
I think it's very fine, but having worked abroad in places like this, although I didn't do any of that, fortunately, it wasn't required of me, so I didn't have that. But I did mention it to the bosses, and they said, oh, but it's not illegal here. So, my challenge to the man who's just been speaking, while he sounds like a decent enough man, is I don't agree that people need to put their money abroad, because the people who are doing this are benefiting from living in this country. People have come to England for thousands of years. Even before the common market was in existence, they used to come here because it's a decent place to live. And I think we need to realise that all this money offshore, which is not paying UK tax, is disadvantaging people who live here.
Because at the end of the day, UK taxes pay for roads, they pay for hospitals, they pay for schools. Frank Cochrane, what do you say?
Well, the main benefit to the clients that we have, if they choose to go offshore, is that they get completely tax-free growth whilst the money is in the offshore domiciled investment. However, well, hang on a second, let me answer the point. Let me finish. But that means that the investment will grow quicker. They will, however, pay the tax when the money is repatriated. And the fact is, because they've made more money, they pay more tax. So I'm afraid your argument is null and void.
You obviously believe what you're saying. That's how you make your money. I'm retired. I'm not grinding any axe. I don't bear any grudge to anybody. It's just an illegal system which I've seen operating.
It's not
Alex,
illegal. It's perfectly legal.
It
is by them, yes.
Alex, you say you saw it operating. I mean, please don't name names for legal reasons, but you were inside accountancy firms who were operating in tax havens. Is that right?
I have operated in 3 of the big 5, and I have seen how the network's set up with international lawyers. There's masses of people. Unless people get the idea of decency and honesty again. I was brought up by a top civil servant, grandfather, and a naval officer. They were both as straight as the day is long.
Well, thank you very much for your call. Paula Tallon, you advise small to medium-sized businesses, and you, like Frank, see offshore as an absolute legitimate part of tax planning.
We do, yes.
But
yes.
also, you say that actually companies do sometimes there's a commercial benefit for the secrecy that offshore can afford. Can you tell us about that?
There's a mixture of reasons why you would use offshore. In particular, if you have somebody who's coming into the UK who hasn't been resident here before, they may need to structure their affairs before they arrive to the UK. And because we have got the non-domicile rules here, and as long as we have them, then we have to advise on them. But also proper commercial reasons. If you're setting up a new venture which may go across a number of jurisdictions, and you may have investors coming from different jurisdictions, it may be that the holding company would have to go somewhere other than the UK, although the UK is a good place to have a holding company. And also there's reasons of privacy. There are loads of people who have offshore companies and pay tax in the UK. So they may have an offshore registered company, but actually it's controlled and managed in the UK. It files UK tax returns. But what they're trying to do is to have privacy maybe from competitors, and it's not linked to tax in any way.
And so that might be that they want to take their business in a new direction, change the structure of it somehow, or buy a property to start another part of their business venture, and they don't want a competitor to get the head
it could be a
start.
number of reasons. And if you take privacy and just ignore the whole offshore bit, in the UK, people set up companies with nominee shareholders and directors. There could be something like you own a property on a particular street, you want to buy the one next door, but you don't want everyone around you to know it's you behind it. And that might be why you would do that. Although now we have rules that you would have to show the beneficial ownership, so you can no longer hide behind those nominee companies and everything else. But there are reasons why people would need privacy. And unfortunately, once it has the word offshore, the assumption is that offshore must equal dishonest. And that's not always the case.
We have to bring non-DOMs into this. And Alex Cobham, the government's planning a further crackdown on non-DOMs. Do you think this is... do you have any sympathy for this idea that people should be able to operate like this?
Well, the non-dom rule is a historic anomaly which I don't think will last that much longer. It's clearly creates a tax inequality for which there's no real justification. But I want to push back on this question about secrecy. I think there are all sorts of reasons why individuals deserve and require privacy. Those reasons do not extend to when you set up a legal vehicle, whether that's a company or anything else. If you are taking advantage of the benefits of a particular legal structure, you also have some responsibilities, and that includes being clear about who the owner is. Nobody benefits from doing business with someone when they don't know who's behind that business, and the opportunities for market manipulation or political conflicts of interest or indeed tax dodging are legion. There's no good reason for that anonymity, I'm afraid. If you want to maintain your privacy, by all means do. There's no reason to set up a company. But if you want to take advantage of a particular legal structure, you need to be clear, and the people who work or might come into contact with that structure need to be clear about the real warm-blooded person standing behind it.
And of course, so a big reason to be offshore is the to put your money into a more favourable tax environment. And over the last years, we've seen numerous headlines about the sort of surprisingly small amount of tax paid in the past by the likes of Starbucks, Amazon, Vodafone and other big names who've set up their operations in low tax jurisdictions. And I know, Alex, you've looked at that a lot, but a number of independent shops in the Welsh town of Cricklehall decided to go offshore a few months ago as well. Their attempts were followed by a BBC crew, and Steve Lewis, one of the business owners, joins us from the BBC's Cardiff studio now. Steve, you own a coffee shop, and this wasn't really about avoiding tax, you say, it was about making a point.
Yes, it was about making a point to one of my major competitors, Caffè Nero, who you haven't mentioned, who I'm reliably told have paid no tax since 2008 in the UK. So it wasn't about avoiding tax, it was about establishing if we could do the same as a Caffè Nero.
Well, I must just say that, we haven't seen Caffè Nero's account, so we don't know what the situation is there at all. We can't say that that's true. But the point is, you were feeling hard done by, that you were paying, as you saw it, a lot to the taxman, and you saw bigger rivals seem to be paying less.
Yes, and when you try to compete on a level playing field, that's very difficult. So what we did is we went offshore to the Isle of Man. It took us 40 minutes to set up an offshore account.
That quickly?
The due diligence was derisory. And we then created a trust company in the Netherlands, which is designed to avoid the withholding tax in the EU. And then we created some intellectual property to put offshore, and that allowed us to circulate money and pay ourselves either in loans or dividends that would be tax-free.
So you were amazed then by how simple it was, as John Cullinane was saying. John, is it really that simple? Does that sound right to you?
Well, I think what I described as simple was illegal offshore invasion.
Oh, well, this isn't illegal offshore evasion. Let's make that clear.
But I'm afraid, what's been described just now doesn't sound that simple to me at all. And I'd have to say, if I was in that position, I'd be concerned about, whether that would actually work when an HMRC looked at it.
Well, that's the point I was about to make, which is that the setting up in itself is not difficult. What's then difficult is persuading HMRC that you have a viable scheme. Now, we put our scheme in front of two of Britain's top tax barristers, and we copied basically the same model as Starbucks are using and simply scaled it down. And they're both of the opinion that would be defendable once it gets in front of the HMRC, but that could take 3 to 7 years. And if we went to a series of appeals, if HMRC decided to challenge us, then that could put at risk about 2 million of my personal wealth, which I personally don't have. So
what's the reaction been of your customers? I mean, there are a number of businesses doing this in the town, aren't there? How many of you are there, and what are customers saying?
Yeah, I mean, the customers are hugely supportive of the notion that if you purchase something on a high street, and let's forget the ones that operate in the internet space, but if you're trading on the high street, you're doing a transaction between you and the customer, and the expectation in Britain, which is a very fair society, is some of that money will come back to what you said earlier, repairing the roads, paying for our schools, and ensuring when we go to A&E, it's not closed. So, that's where I challenge the like of Frank and the industry, that they're creating these grey areas, which are tax avoidance, which are encouraging these companies to avoid tax.
Oh, I'll have to put that to you, Frank.
Yeah, I was going to say, to be honest with you, the majority of the business that we do doesn't involve going into these areas that they seem to think that we do. We are a big specialist in using AIM share portfolios for business property relief to get rid of inheritance tax for clients who are in a situation where their joint net wealth is over 650,000. Perfectly legal. Everybody knows that it's available. We can use VCT schemes, EIS schemes, and these actually put money into the economy of the UK, but they do grant the person the 30% tax relief on the contributions that they make.
Yeah, just tell us how that works and exactly how you think that helps businesses in the UK.
Well, it helps businesses because it's one of the main sources that they can use for venture capital. I mean, the whole point about a venture capital scheme is that rather than go to the banks and pay extortionate interest rates, you can go to a venture capital arrangement. They will give you the money to help to build your business. But the person that's actually putting that money up, because it's risk capital, they are entitled by law to a 30% tax relief on the contributions that they make. So it's a perfectly legal way of you reducing your personal income tax and having a massive benefit to the economy of this country, because you're the one that's actually funding the future growth of some of these smaller companies.
Steve Lewis, I just want to go back to you because you've got another kind of branch of this campaign at the moment. You've got a petition online. You're collecting, actually tens of thousands of signatures. And the idea is you want to get yourself onto HM Revenue and Customs Governing Board. What do you hope that will achieve if you manage it?
Well, we've got 152,000 signatures, and I've got considerable amount of political support as well. I've met with John McDonnell. I've also due to meet with a number of politicians next week to support the move, because at the moment the board is not representative. The board is made up of 4 Big Four accountancy partners and 5 big business partners. So it's not representative of small business, bearing in mind about 14% of the Britain's tax take comes from businesses the size of mine. So by challenging them to say, let's get somebody on the board that represents small business and then go for some disruptive innovation so that we start challenging the likes of the tax industry experts you've got on the programme today around this whole area of transparency when you step from tax planning everything to tax efficiency, to tax avoidance, and then tax abuse, all of which, by the way, is legal. But as your caller, Alex, who called in earlier, said, is it moral and is it correct? And it's that lack of transparency that's allowing us to challenge the like of your experts today, the companies they represent, and the high worth net individuals they
Okay,
represent.
Steve Lewis, thank you. Let's go back to the phone lines. Richard's on the line from Cornwall. Richard, what's your point, please?
Yeah, I'm a small businessman, and I believe that we should all be publishing our tax returns, because the current system means that we, the general populace, are paying more in tax to cover for the fact that the richest and big business are allowed to dodge their taxes. But the tax return is not a full picture. It's what your accountant thinks you can get away with. So I believe to make the system work properly, we need to nationalise in inverted commas, if you like, accountants, to keep them at arm's length from business and from the government, so they can say, this is a fair amount of tax for you to pay. Do you want to challenge it? But the current system, you don't employ an accountant unless he minimises your tax. That's where we're losing billions.
John Cullinane, accountants like you should be nationalised.
Well, I think if they were nationalised, they wouldn't be independent of the government, would they? They would be.
I suppose Richard has a point, though, doesn't he? That the people who are sending their money offshore and who are exploiting loopholes in some cases, and in some cases doing even worse than that, they are being advised by professionals, and there's a lot of money people are making. The professionals, the advisors, the tax planners are making a lot of money out of this.
Well, firstly, I mean, every time there's any legal change made, it tends to be in the direction of more and more compliance obligations being put on companies. So, companies are having to do the money laundering checks that were talked about earlier on. They're having to take steps to guess how people might use their operations to evade tax and take steps against it. So they need a lot of advice in how to actually comply with the law, which is a huge area, which is...
And also how to stay just within the limits. But,
I think everybody is entitled to pay tax within the law and not to pay more than they need to. That's perfectly reasonable if they've got different ways of doing things.
Does there need to be more light shed on this? I mean, Steve Lewis is basically talking about what he sees as a kind of cosy relationship between HM Revenue and Customs and the big businesses.
I think this goes to a very key question, which I think has been obscured up to now, which is when we talk about secrecy versus transparency, do we mean secrecy from the authorities or secrecy from the public? Because there are perfectly reasonable commercial reasons and privacy reasons why individuals and to some extent companies might want to keep things from their competitors and so on.
In the UK, we have a principle.
But they shouldn't keep it from the tax authorities.
Could I make a point there, Ruth? Because in transparency terms, I was told when we made the programme with the BBC that in the last 10 years, only 2 of the senior tax inspectors in HMRC, when they've left HMRC, have not ended up working for one of the big 4 accountants or one of the biggest group of tax multinationals in UK. So one of their career path moves, once they've worked as a relationship manager in HMRC, is to then go and work for the people they've been advising on tax.
Well, John Cullinane, maybe one way to clear all this up would be to get rid of this principle of taxpayer confidentiality that we have in the UK and open up all these discussions that go on and open up companies and even maybe individuals' tax returns. We've seen the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the leader of the Labour opposition do this. Should we all be doing this?
I think, to be frank, there is a loss of public confidence post-credit crunch in a lot of large institutions and governments and businesses, and this is kind of behind this concern. And I don't think the current UK position, which is at the extreme end of taxpayer confidentiality, is going to hold. But I would question whether you or I or many people would want their tax returns disclosed. And I also do question what good it does, because frankly, people are not in a position to do HMRC's job and review people's tax returns. A lot of the things that upset people are not really HMRC not doing their job. They don't like the law as it currently is. They don't like the opportunities that are available to multinational companies. They don't like the non-domicile regime. And those are things that can be changed. And I think a lot of this criticism of HMRC is very, very unfair. They have to apply the law.
I agree, and that's why I want to get on the board to help them do exactly that, because
Steve,
they are civil servants.
I just want to go to the phone lines. Rayleigh's there in Folkestone. Rayleigh, what's your point?
Well, I was just listening about the transparency. I'm not holding Finland as a shining example. It's a completely different country, barely 6 million people, and it's a far more homogeneous country than UK. But in Finland, all corporate and all individuals' tax returns are available to anybody to see on the Revenue's website. And not in detail, but a summary which shows you how much you have earned and how much you have paid.
And what's your experience of this system been? Just very briefly, how's it worked for you when you've lived there?
Well, I have been here for 40 years, and it has come since I left Finland, so I have no personal experience of it. But I do know a friend of mine who, for 1 year, happened to have an extremely well-paid job, and she was caught speeding, and the police officer who caught her checked her her income on the tax office website, and because the fines are rated according to your income, she got her almighty big fine.
Thank you very much for your call. And we've also had a call from Joanna. I'll just summarise. She says she doesn't want open tax returns because she doesn't want people to know her finances. She's a single woman living on her own, and she says sometimes her neighbours resent her being being in that state and seemingly being in control of her finances. So you would have to accept that people would know rather a lot about you. That's all we have time for. My thanks today to John Cullinane, Paula Tallon, Frank Cochrane, Steve Lewis and Alex Cobham. Thanks to you for all your calls and emails. You can listen again at our website, bbc.co.uk/moneybox, and download the Moneybox podcast too. Paul Lewis is back at noon on Saturday with Moneybox, and I'll be taking more of your calls here on Moneybox Live next Wednesday afternoon. Thank you for listening to the download of Moneybox Live, first broadcast on the 13th of April 2016. More information and how to contact us on our BBC Moneybox website.